There's a trend of refineries leaving California. Recently, Phillips 66, another refinery, announced that they're leaving California. The state will be short of 80,000 barrels of gasoline a day, which is 10% of our consumption. My guest today is Skip York, who's an energy consultant with decades of experience in this space. He's here to tell us what are the potential options for California. There are some proposals of California taking over refineries. He's also going to discuss this.
We're on a path where demand is going to continue to decline for petroleum products in California. We're already there. We're already seeing that decline is happening. This isn't theoretical.
I'm Siyama Khorrami. Welcome to California Insider. Skip, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me here.
You know, California state may take over refineries from some reports that we've heard. And refineries in California in general are leaving the state. Can you tell us what's happening with refineries?
There's really two things that are happening. One is the primary fuel operations that California refineries do is to make gasoline. That's what they were designed to do. And gasoline demand in California peaked about 20 years ago. And it's been on about a 1% decline since then.
1% a year?
1% a year. And so you've got a declining market, and that starts to challenge how do you place the volume that you refine, the gasoline or diesel that you refine. The other one is the cost basis. You know, there's a lot of regulatory issues and compliance issues that California refineries have that they don't have in other parts of the U.S. And that just makes operating refineries more expensive and more challenging, not only in terms of just the cost, but also the regulatory compliance, getting the permits and all those sorts of activities you have to do to stay compliant. We just saw recently the CEO of Phillips 66 mentioned at an industry conference that one of the reasons why they're closing the refinery in Los Angeles in October is because the growing regulatory cost burden over an accumulation of years had just become one of the points where it was just becoming uncompetitive to operate that refinery. And they had to make a decision from a corporate standpoint to exit that refinery by closing it in October. So that's a fairly common theme that we've heard as refineries have closed, is that it's just an increasing, the cost basis keeps going up, and it just makes it harder and harder to operate. And at some point, they can't justify putting capital into the refineries anymore, and then they're forced to close them.
Now, what's the impact of that, Skip, when somebody like Phillips 66 leaves the state or they don't want to operate here? How's that impacting us?
So the way it's going to impact California is twofold. One is that you lose the domestic production of gasoline, the in-state production, because that refinery will no longer be making 80,000 barrels a day of gasoline. But demand isn't going to drop 80,000 barrels a day. Demand right now is about just under 800,000 barrels per day. You're going to lose about 10% of the supply when that refinery shuts down. You're going to have to find another way to do it, and the only way to do that, supply that gasoline, will be to bring in waterborne imports, which California is already bringing in about 100,000 barrels a day of gasoline to balance the market.
Gasoline.
Gasoline. And now with the closure of the Phillips 66 refinery, you're going to see that nearly double as we get towards the end of 2025 and into 2026. And that becomes an issue for California consumers because you lose the availability of the gasoline. The other thing you now do is you've made the supply chain links. The supply chain is even longer now. A lot more things can go wrong if you're bringing gasoline from the Middle East or from India and sailing it halfway around the world into California. More things can and will go wrong, which means that the supply becomes more uncertain and more volatile as you make less and less gasoline inside the state.
Where does the gasoline come from? Is it coming from India and Middle East for California, the suppliers?
So for California, we're really seeing it really comes from three locations. It's kind of like, you call it the Northern Asia, which is like South Korea. There's another pocket that will come out of India. And then the third one is we're starting to see some volumes coming out of the Middle East because the Middle East has built some brand new world-class refineries that can make the California specifications, and so we're starting to see volume coming in out of the Middle East as well. But predominantly, that 100,000 barrels a day is coming from Asia. It's just starting from three different points of origin.
Why is it coming from that far away?
Well, because the other refineries that can make California-grade gasoline are in the Pacific Northwest, And they're already supplying gasoline to California. So you're trying to find new barrels of gasoline. Your choice is really going to be to come out of Asia and sail all the way across the Pacific, or you come out of the U.S. Gulf Coast and go through the Panama Canal. There are only a couple of refineries in the Gulf Coast that can make California specifications, and then you have to transit the Panama Canal, which is really expensive. So it turns out that it's just more competitive. It's more the economics are better of coming all the way from India and sailing all the way across the Pacific into California. Those economics are actually better than coming out of the U.S. Gulf Coast through the Panama Canal and into California.
And is it hard to make this gasoline? Because you said only a few refineries can make it.
There's a number of specifications that California requires that are much tighter than you see for gasoline grades in other parts of the U.S. or in other parts of the world. And what that does is it just makes that blending window that refiners can make. Those specifications get so tight that you really don't have a lot of latitude and flexibility into how do you get to meet that specification, because there's really there's very few formulas that will actually be California compliant. What that says then is that if you're sitting in the U.S. Gulf Coast, if you're a refiner that's sitting there, is you have to have dedicated tankage, and you have to have dedicated processes, and there just isn't enough volume to justify making those investments to make the quality. So it's not that the refiners can't make the specification, it's that the economics don't work because of the volume is small enough that it doesn't justify the tankage and the logistics and the processing that they would have to put in place in order to make that unique California gasoline.
Some of you may be wondering, why are we talking about Shenyun on California Insider? It's a dance about China, but ancient China. I'm a big fan of Shenyun. I've been to it 14 times. Every year I go. The first time I went to Shenyun, it was so amazing. It was so uplifting. The colors, the energy, they put you into scenes of thousands of years ago. And you feel like how the ancient people lived. And you get to appreciate the history of humanity. There's a lot more to this show. It's going to be here in Southern California, and I want to make sure you guys go see it. You don't want to miss this show. You have to see it at least once. And make sure to tell us what you think afterwards.
It was spectacular, so beautiful.
I thought I was going to heaven.
Oh, it was electric.
I'm getting chills talking about it.
It gets a 10 from me, that's for sure.
It was that good.
Absolutely marvelous.
Hands down the best show I've ever seen.
Now, is the rest of the U.S. different, completely different, or each state has their own? Or is it just California, or a few states follow?
So a few states will follow. There are some states that there's no state that has specifications as tight as California does. Some states will have slightly tighter specifications, especially in certain times of the year. But broadly speaking, outside of California, there are really two grades of gasoline. There is what's called conventional gasoline, which is consumed in the vast majority of the states. And then there's another gasoline called reformulated gasoline that has a better ozone property. It's better for smog areas that have had smog problems. You'll see reformulated gasoline consumed in those cities. But California's reformulated gasoline, which is referred to as CARB, those specifications are even tighter than the reformulated gasoline that you see consumed in the rest of the U.S. That's one of the problems that California has, is that when a refinery goes down and they lose that supply coming out of that gasoline, there is no fungible supply that they can bring into California for two reasons. They don't have the logistics in place, because California logistics are designed to push gasoline out of California into Arizona, Nevada, Oregon. The other part of it is the specifications are different. So even if they could physically get the gasoline into the state, they can't get the gasoline to the specification that California needs it to be. So whenever a refinery goes down in California, it's sort of a double whammy. They lose the supply, and the alternatives that are out there take weeks, if not months.
So it has to come from India and other places because we don't have it.
And it probably takes you up to 6 weeks to get a cargo put together in the Middle East or India, and then it sails. And that's about a 30-day sail from India to the West Coast. Is going to take about 30. Well, that's 30 days, and there's no way to compress that. But even before you put that, you've got to build the bulk up of the volume to put into the ship. You've got to get a ship, you've got to build the bulk of the volume and put it into the ship, and then you have to sail
Does
it
it
30
take a
days.
lot of time to do this refining process?
It will take time to do it because they didn't know the incident was coming. So if you're heading into the gasoline driving season, you've got refiners in India or the Middle East that they know that California specific, there's going to be a surge in California gasoline demand because there is every summer. That they can prepare for and they can plan and say, when do I need to start building my volume and getting my ships aligned?
But if
in order
there's
to
an
sail them?
incident,
But if there's an
something
incident,
happened,
and they weren't in that driving season, now they have to, the first thing they have to do on the very front end is scramble for a ship and scramble to put the volume together. Then once they do those things, then they have to sail it for 30 days.
Now, so from what you're saying, if we have more of these refinery closures, we will have to buy them from other countries, and it will tighten the supply more, right? In a sense, like if there is a hiccup, the problem can become bigger.
And the problem can become bigger, and it will become bigger because, refineries, they will go down for various reasons. There will be unplanned outages. Every refinery has one at some point. So even the refineries in the Middle East and in India, there will be an unplanned outage at some point. Well, that's going to impact the production of gasoline in that refinery, whether it's a European gasoline or a U.S. gasoline or CARB gasoline. Those incidents are going to happen, but they're going to happen farther away from where California is now. The flexibility in the system with the closure of the refineries we've seen in California really over the last 20 years, but really over the last decade, all of the flexibility has been taken out of the system. In fact, there is no flexibility left because we're now importing 10% of the California demand is met by imports.
How much was it before? There was a lot more refineries before, right?
When there was a lot more refineries, California has always brought in some volumes of gasoline historically, but if you look back 20 years ago, you might have been looking at maybe 20 to 25,000 barrels per day. You're now up to 100,000 barrels a day. So the import requirement has tripled in the last 10 to 15 years.
And now we are you said we are using 800,000 a day, and we are importing 100, and we're about to lose 80, right? 80,000, another 10%. Right?
Another 10%. So the only solution to that is, because you're not going to make the refineries up in the Pacific Northwest any bigger, the only solution is going to be that 80,000 barrels a day is going to have to come from someplace off the U.S. West Coast. And that's going to either be more volume coming out of Asia and the Middle East, or maybe you now have enough ratable volume that now maybe building a Jones Act tanker and putting it in service to run between the U.S. Gulf Coast and California. Does that now finally make sense? Because it's not just that you have to go through the Panama Canal, you have to use a special vessel that is U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. insured. It's called a Jones Act vessel. And if you're going from one U.S. port to another, everything between two U.S. ports moves on a Jones Act vessel. And we only have about 50 of those product vessels in service today in the U.S. But they're all busy now today. All those Jones Act vessels are going from the U.S. Gulf Coast up the U.S. East Coast. We don't have any extra
Why
Jones
does
Act
it have
vessels.
to be that special tanker?
It's
just
a
a
regulation. It came back from the Clean Water Act of 1990, and then there was an oil spill legislation
Because
in the
they're
90s.
safe, probably environmentally safe.
They're
because
seen as
could-
being safer. They're double-hulled tankers. The liability can attach. It's going to be hard to escape liability because it's a U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, U.S. insured vessel. So back in the 1990s, the thought was for environmental and for operating purposes and for safety reasons, we want these vessels built and maintained in the United States. But that's not just for the oil industry. Every ship that goes between two U.S. ports is a Jones Act vessel. So you really notice it in the refining industry.
Now, about the idea of California taking over the refineries. So essentially, this is what they want to do, right? This might be a thought where we are losing this 10% capacity, 80,000 barrels, we are losing them. What are we going to do? We're going to operate it, right? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a very expensive, anytime you get involved with a refinery, it's a very expensive proposition. There's a joke in the industry that goes with, how do you make $1 million in refining? And the answer is, start with $10 million and buy a refinery. and you then lose $9 million. These are low margin, high capital intense assets. They take a lot of maintenance and a lot of care to keep running effectively. So the first question I think for the state of California is, what are you trying to achieve? And are you trying to achieve the replacement of that 80,000 barrels a day of gasoline? And so rather than reaching into the offshore, the foreign supply chains, let's try to keep it a California supply chain. I think that's what their rationale would be. Now, the state has not been very articulate as to what they would want to do and what their objectives would be for owning a refinery, but I think that's probably pretty close to what they'd be trying to do. What they need to understand is, refineries are very expensive to own and operate and maintain, and there's a reason why Phillips 66 is closing that refinery. It's a very high cost asset to operate. It's going to cost exactly the same, if not more, for the state of California to operate that refinery than for a corporation to operate the refinery. So I'm not really clear on what are they actually going to try to achieve, other than maintaining the volume. I think the first thing the state ought to ask itself is there a lower cost way to get that 80,000 barrels a day? And then there's going to be risks associated with it. If you're going all the way from India, there are going to be logistics risks in place that you wouldn't have if you were operating a California refinery. But if you're operating a refinery in California, there's going to be a set of risks around operating that refinery too. So what's the low cost way to do it, and what's the low risk way of doing it? And then try to find, of all those options, which one's the best one to take. I'm just not really clear yet what the state's trying to do.
The idea was that these refineries make a lot of money. There was this idea that there's some level of price gouging because they make a lot of money from this refining, and there's some money that was missing, in a sense, like they make a lot of money, but it's kind of doesn't fit the idea that some are leaving. Can you tell us about that? Does this business make a lot of money? And
so it doesn't make. So the way to think about a refinery is think about it over like a 5 to 7 year period. And the reason why I'm picking 5 to 7 years is that about every 5 years, a refinery goes through what's called a major turnaround. And what that means is you bring down parts of the refinery and do a lot of heavy duty maintenance on it. And that's something you're going to do every 5 years. So what you want to be looking at is, does this refinery operate and make enough money, not in any given month, but over that 5 year period, does it generate enough income to fund that next turnaround that's coming? And if you look at refineries on like a 5 or a 7 year basis, they tend to be very much sort of break-even assets, because the profit that it looks like they're making in any given month or in any given quarter is actually going to be spent 5 years later in that turnaround. And so you need to be thinking about what's the profitability of that refinery over that life cycle.
Now, what does that turnaround mean? Like, is it the time to fix up? Do they have to do regulatory?
So that's when they'll try to do all of the work that needs to be done when a unit is cold. So you have to take the unit out of service. It's when you're going to do your regulatory compliance. You're going to do your maintenance. You may actually try to do some enhancements to that unit. And that's what you're going to try and do in that turnaround window. And you plan these turnarounds for about 3 years. They may happen over a 60-day period. Normally, we see the refineries in turnaround. They typically will go into turnaround in the late fall and early winter, because that's when demand is the lowest. Sometimes you'll see some go into turnaround in the spring, and they will tend to be like 30 to 60-day turnarounds. But it took them 3 years to figure out what are they going to do in those 60 days. But they're going to try and do all of that equipment replacement and maintenance and compliance. Sometimes there might be a new regulation in place, and you time complying with that regulation with that turnaround because there's a new piece of equipment that you need to put in place, or you have to enhance an existing piece of equipment in order to stay compliant. They will try to schedule those at turnarounds because the effects of not only on profitability, but just the operating effect of, I have to take this unit down now, out of cycle, in order to do some work on it. That's very disruptive to the entire refinery. And that's one of the issues, like when you have these unplanned incidents that happened in a refinery and the refinery unexpectedly goes down, it tends to be, it tends to be down for a fairly substantial period of time because you weren't planning on having to do that sort of work, and now you've got to do that work and then bring the refinery back up. And they don't turn on and off like light switches. You have to bring them down safely, do the work, and then you have to bring them back up. And you want to be very careful about when you're dialing them down and dialing the refineries back up. You want to be very careful at those points because that's when the refinery can get out of balance, and and you want to avoid any sort of safety or risk or health issues that could be associated with that refinery getting out of balance with itself.
Now, in a sense, why do you think people own these refineries if they are break even? What's the logic behind having this?
So the logic for owning them was always that the best returns in the oil industry are in the upstream, so producing the crude oil. But the crude oil really doesn't have a whole lot of value unless you can process it through into something that's usable, that consumers can buy, and that's the piece that the refinery is. And so the way the industry built itself up is you would have oil companies that had oil production, but then they needed to build a refinery to process that crude oil into finished products that they could then sell to people. So where was money typically made? Most of the money was made in the upstream. There was some money made in marketing and retail, and the refinery was really just an asset that got you from the upstream to the end consumer. They weren't designed to make money. They were designed to be very effective at processing crude oil into finished products. Then what happened I guess was in the 1990s, we started to see a lot of those oil companies deintegrate themselves. So they started to just focus on the upstream or just focus on marketing. And then you had these standalone refiners, you'll often hear the term of merchant refiners. And those are refiners that don't own crude production. They may not own retail. All they're doing is trying to operate that refinery in a safe and profitable manner. But those profit margins that they're earning are much less than the profit margins you would see on the other sides of the refinery, either from the upstream or from the marketing. Historically, they were not built to be profit centers. They were built to be processing centers. Get the oil from a raw crude that no one can use to a finished product that people can use. And do that safely and efficiently. That's what the business model was for refining for over 100 years.
So for somebody like Phillips 66, they're leaving us like the state is losing these 80,000 barrels, and can they raise the price or?
Well, what's important is that remember that gasoline is like all petroleum products; they're commodities, right? So if you're making California grade gasoline, the gasoline is exactly the same specification no matter which service station you're going to. So here's the challenge that someone like a Phillips 66 would have. What if we'd raise the price of gasoline at our Phillips 66 stations? And then we could make more money, and then that could help us with our operating costs at our refineries and keep the refinery operating. Well, what are people going to do? Well, when they see the price going up at one service station, people stop going to that service station and they go to another service station where the prices didn't go up because they can save a few cents per gallon. And so Phillips doesn't really have the ability to set gasoline prices at the price it would need in order to justify continuing to operate the refinery, because all of the other service stations that aren't supplied by Phillips 66 don't need and won't change their prices, and customers will flock from those higher price service stations to the lower price service stations. And that's what kind of puts a ceiling on what price you can charge. So they're sort of forced to say, the price of gasoline is what it is. I have to accept that what the price is at the pump is what it is, minus all those distribution costs to get it back to the refinery and say, well, that's what my revenue is. And raising prices isn't going to make me any more money because I'm not going to be selling gasoline.
So if Phillips 66 is not making it, then this state is probably not going to make it, right? With those operations, with those plants, would they be taking over those plants, or?
I think what they would have to do is the state would have to be willing to, the state may say our objective is to make the maximum amount of gasoline out of this refinery that we can make, and we're not really worried about what margin it makes. We're just going to try and make as much gasoline as possible to supply the state of California. What they will discover is that that's the same amount of gasoline, in all likelihood, that's the same amount of gasoline that the corporate refiner was operating the refinery at before the state took it over. Because the whole name of the game is make as much gasoline, because that's your most valuable product in the refinery. Make as much of it as you possibly can and get it into the market. So the state's going to discover they probably can't get any more gasoline out of that refinery than what the previous corporate owner was getting. Now you run into the opposite problem. If they try to price gasoline less than what they see all the other service stations charging, what's going to happen? Everybody's going to flock to those service stations, buy up that volume, and then that volume is exhausted. And now the people who didn't get to that service station are now going to have to go to some other service station where the prices are higher. So they're going to run into the exact same problem that selling gasoline, just like Phillips 66 can't increase the price of gasoline in order to make refineries more profitable, the state of California won't be able to reduce the price of gasoline to make in a meaningful way to make
like a nonprofit,
to make the price of gasoline across the whole state go down. They would not have enough volume to make that to force prices down.
Now, Skip, what is the solution to the situation? Because it seems like the volume of the gas is going down, and these companies have to deal with a lot of the upkeep, and it's not worth it to them. And
yeah, and I think I'm not really sure what solution there is that doesn't result in, increasing pressure somewhere in the system. But I think you've got it right, is that gasoline demand is in decline. Petroleum diesel supply is in decline because renewable diesel is now taking the place of more than half of the petroleum diesel in the state of California. So to keep refineries operating in California, you're going to have to increasingly have volume that you can't place in California, and you're going to have to export it out someplace else. Now, you're already pushing as much gasoline and diesel into Arizona and Nevada and Oregon as you can. So that means you're exporting diesel to other parts of the country, and a lot other parts of the world. And right now we do see a fairly substantial amount of diesel that flows south down into Latin America. You're going to have to see more of that. You're going to have to see more. What's going to happen is more marine logistics, traffic, and congestion. You're going to be bringing in more gasoline vessels.
And then you're going to send out
more diesel vessels. Those are different vessels because you don't put gasoline and diesel in the same vessel.
So we have to export diesel, essentially.
So you're going to maintain the number of refineries, you're going to have to import gasoline because you can't make enough gasoline in California to meet demand. And you're going to have to export diesel because we're already seeing that happening as well. We're already exporting a lot of diesel out of California. That number is just going to increase. So the long-term solution is that I think we're on a path where demand is going to continue to decline for petroleum products in California. We're already there. We're already seeing that decline is happening. This isn't theoretical. Gasoline demand has been declining for 20 years. Diesel demand has been pretty flat since COVID, but it's being replaced. Petroleum diesel is now being replaced by renewable diesel. We're now at a point where the pressure on California refineries is just going to keep increasing. And the solution, I think, is, unfortunately for the workers in those refineries, I think the solution is over time, we will see more refineries close in California because there just won't be enough market left for them to compete and generate enough income to justify that turnaround, that life cycle of every 5 years they have to put in several $100 million to keep the refinery viable for another 5 years. That's not a solution. I think that's just the pathway that we're on.
And what about Californians? Do we get impacted by higher gas prices, or do you think it's not going to have an impact on the price?
I think more than the price, I think there will be increasing pressure on gasoline prices because the crude oil that would come into a California refinery moves on a much larger vessel. So it's a lot cheaper to move crude oil into California than to move product. So as you have to import more
moving
product,
gasoline or other products, or
other products as well. So, but just think of it very simply, if you had to move crude oil into California to process to make 80,000 barrels a day of gasoline, it's more expensive to move 80,000 barrels a day of gasoline into California.
Because the ship is smaller.
Because the ship is smaller. You're going to need smaller ships, more frequent ships. That's going to increase harbor traffic and harbor congestion. So that's going to be part of the problem. The other part is because that supply chain is going to get longer, I think California consumers not only run the risk of being exposed to rising gasoline prices as each refinery closes down, but I think we're also going to be in an environment where prices could become more volatile as each refinery
So
closes.
they jump up and
Come up and then they come down because something happens in that supply chain between India and on that voyage between India and the West Coast, and all of a sudden the gasoline didn't show up when the market expected it or needed it to show up. It's delayed. Prices are going to react to that absence of volume. But then it does show up, and now you get this big slug of gasoline that comes in, and now prices are going to go down. So I think California consumers are likely going to be in an environment where not only are they going to see increasing upward pressure on prices, but they're also probably going to see more volatile prices around that rising gasoline price.
if there was a plan from the state that's kind of outside of the box. The CEC, California Energy Commission, had some recommendations, and one of them was this one, to operate the refineries. Is there any other thoughts that could be viable besides this one?
They put about 12 suggestions out there, and one of them that actually might have some traction was the idea of, instead of the state running refineries, that the state becomes an importer of gasoline. So the state of California actually goes out into the global market and buys gasoline volume, and it brings it into the state on a ratable basis. Now, there's going to be a logistic issue about, well, when you offload that gasoline, where are you going to put it? But let's suppose that, let's park that.
So no storage.
That can be, yeah, there's going to be a storage issue, but let's park that and say that we can solve. Would that, could that be a more cost-effective way for the state of California to guarantee sort of that supply of gasoline will be lost because a refinery is shut down? We, the state of California, will go into the market, and we're just going to be a large buyer of gasoline. Now, you're going to be known to be a large buyer of gasoline, and there's some issues around that. But those trading issues can be managed. Is that a more cost-effective way for the state to sort of say, I'm going to make sure that there's this reliable supply of gasoline that comes in, because I'm going to become one of the importers. The state of California, will become one of the importers of gasoline, and they would bring that gasoline and then they would sell it to somebody in the wholesale market. And the state of California wouldn't need to own retail service stations. They could sell it to a wholesaler who would then move it to the retail service stations, just like the existing system does. That was one of the ideas that they proposed. And there might be something in there maybe that's something to look at. Because one of the advantages that brings is, as the demand for gasoline goes down and you're closing refineries in California, if the state's operating a refinery, how and when is the state going to close a refinery? Given that there are other refineries around it, the other refineries are closing. If you're buying gasoline, at some point, that's much easier to wind down because you just let contracts expire. You have these long-term contracts, you just let the contracts expire, and the volume will just naturally compress down to what you need. That actually would be an easier process to manage exiting. It would be a lot easier for the state to exit trading gasoline than it would be for the state to exit owning and operating a refinery.
Now, is it normal for a state to get into the operation of buying gasoline and buying oil, or is it usually private companies do that?
It's in the world, the vast majority of it is private companies that's done. I mean, where you do see government-owned refineries are the national oil companies that are predominantly in the countries, the OPEC member countries. So, countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. Where you do see it is where not just the refineries, but the entire petroleum industry has been nationalized. And now the government has a company that owns the entire industry within that country. What you can say about government-owned refineries, they don't run very well. There is a big difference between what you can see is, even within the same country, the government-owned refineries do not operate as well as the privately owned refineries in the same country. We're seeing that right now in Nigeria, where the refineries owned by the Nigerian National Oil Company, they operate at about 20 to 30% utilization. The brand new Dangote refinery that was built by a private entrepreneur, that refinery is operating at about 65 to 70%.
Wow.
And rising, right? Because the reason why it's operating at 70% is because They're still starting this refinery up, but they're already able to demonstrate that within the same country, the private sector can operate a refinery 3 times better than the national oil company does. And we see that across the country, across the world, wherever you look at, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and probably Kuwait, refineries in most government-owned refineries do not operate nearly as well as as the nearest private sector refinery operating in the same jurisdiction or in the same region. That's something that the state of California needs to take, is that there's something about this, that the private sector just operates these assets better than a government-owned sector. If the state of California wanted to get into operating refineries, they need to be realistic about it and ask themselves, what are they going to do differently than all these other government-owned refineries that have much lower utilization rates? How would they actually operate it differently and expect to get a different result? That's another reason why the state owning a refinery is a really complex issue. And I think a lot of homework has to get done before. I would encourage the state, there's a lot of homework to be done before you make this move, because they're big moves and they're expensive moves. And they just need to keep it in mind that when you look at the rest of the world, you don't see a lot of government-owned operating success in this industry. You normally see the best assets are operated by private sector companies. If the state were interested in getting into the refining business, right, the best thing they could do is to take a refining that's already operating and acquire that asset. So, for example, the Phillips 66 refinery in LA is going to close in October. If the state's serious about getting into refining, that's probably an asset to look at, because the current owner is willing to separate themselves from it, and it's an operating asset, so everything is working today. And that's going to be the easiest and best case for the state to come in and own a refinery, is to own one that's already operating well.
Now, are the current owners leaving, just like they're just giving it up, or do the state have to buy it? Does the state have to buy it?
I guess the state would have to buy it, because one of the things that Phillips 66 is doing is they are doing a redevelopment strategy with a real estate development
to change that company to something
and say,
else.
what would we do with this? What would we do with this site if it wasn't a refinery? What would we do with it? And so they have plans. They will not be operating a refinery on that site. They aren't leaving the state of California, because Phillips 66 still has service stations. It still has the renewable diesel plant near San Francisco. But they're going to do something different with that
So
acreage.
the state has to still invest a good amount to get into this business.
So the state would still have to invest something. I don't think there's any way you could see that Phillips 66 would just part with it for free, because the land is worth something. And Phillips 66 is saying, if it's not a refinery, what is it? And we're going to figure out how do we redevelop and repurpose that land for something else. Suppose it does happen. Well, the state now is taking over an operating asset. And that's the best place to be in refining, something that's already operating and manageable, with an employment base, with workers who actually understand that asset. Because if you close that refinery, those people are going to wander off to other jobs. Now, if you wanted to reopen it a few years later, you're going to be hiring in people.
Does it cost a lot more to do that?
It's going to cost a lot more, because it's been out of operation, so there will be things that just haven't been maintained because you weren't operating. That work is going to have to be done. And you're going to have to hire a workforce to operate that refinery. You're not going to get the same workforce that you had when it was in operation. So, there is this sweet spot, for lack of a better term, for the state of California, if they're serious about doing it.
To do it with the one that's closing
There is
down.
an asset that's available right now that is operational, and the owner is willing to separate from it. So there is an opportunity. There would be an opportunity, but that opportunity is about
It's
6
only
months
6
left.
months.
Yeah.
So it might be hard for them.
It might be very hard to put that deal together.
Now, in a sense, you mentioned that some of these jobs will go away. What kind of jobs are they in the refining business?
So in the refineries, if you're looking inside, you really have sort of 2 groups that work inside a refinery. You have the administration, and those are sort of like white-collar jobs, office workers, and they're sitting in the refinery administration buildings. The vast majority of the employees are blue-collar that would be if they weren't working here, they'd be working in some other continuous manufacturing process. That's what they would ideally like to do. What we do know about the state of California is that blue-collar workers in refineries make about 20% more than blue-collar workers in California that don't work in refineries. So these are really well-paying jobs, and I think Phillips 66 Los Angeles has about 1,000 employees that would be impacted by this. And they will be impacted because when you close the refinery and you're going to repurpose it, you won't be using any of that blue-collar labor anymore. And those people,
They have to go find other manufacturing
they're going to have to go find some other manufacturing job. And that job may or may not be that job may be in California, that job may be in some other state.
Skip York, energy consultant. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Great. Thanks for having me.
What are your thoughts about refinery exodus out of California? Let us know what you think of the potential solutions in this scenario for California. You can always email me at siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. Remember, we read all of your comments and emails. We'll see you next time.